So we're just going to talk about some of the field work we did this summer with ACCDC. Like Bob said, we both started last summer, so that was our first summer of doing this field work. And so we had a variety of projects that we did last year. We'll talk about two main ones. The first is the Bredor Lake Priority Place project. This is a continuation of funding from last year. Last year we focused, continuation of the year before we started in 2021. That focuses on black ash habitat and other rare vascular plants. And then this past year, the focus was mainly on species at risk and rare lichen species. So for this project, one of the main components was using habitat suitability models for our surveys to hopefully predict where species at risk lichens will be found. We had a fairly successful field season. These are all the species at risk lichens in Nova Scotia. The green ones are the ones we found. So we found wrinkled shingle lichen, blue felt lichen, we found eastern water fan and frosted glass whiskers. Potentially found white rimmed shingle lichen, TBD on that one. And then the final three, black foam lichen, boreal felt, and scaly fringe, we didn't find. So getting into some of the species I talked about, one of the highlights was finding eastern water fan lichen. This is a rare species of generally slow-moving streams, mostly in Cape Breton, a few spots in Cumberland County, and then it's fairly common in Fundy National Park as well. Peltigera hydrotheria is the scientific name, and it's fairly, so like I said, it's fairly rare. In Cape Breton, it's usually above 170 meters. We found that fairly consistent. And so we looked at a few spots for habitat, trying to determine which one was best in Cape Breton. Often if you see kind of in these corner of these pools here, that's where you find it sometimes, where there's a little bit of water movement to keep the nutrients flushing, but then not too much. So we struck out on some of these more steeper waterfall type streams, but we did get luck on Middle River, which is up a little south of the Highlands. And you can see it's more of a slow moving stream. And we found 15 new occurrences on this one river over the course of one field day, which was quite exciting. Moving on to our next one, frosted glass whiskers. I found this in Eastern Cape Breton. It was the 4th Cape Breton record. It was quite exciting. It's quite a small lichen. It's on this exposed heartwood of these red maple trees in these swamps. I don't think you can see my mouse, but anyways, this middle picture here, the exposed heartwood, it's kind of, it has to be exposed a little bit to the elements. It can't be too exposed. So it has pretty strict habitat requirements. And this tree just kind of stood out like a beacon in this little swamp, and it was just covered. And it was the only tree in the area, but it was quite exciting to find that one for a fairly rare Cape Breton species. Probably the most commonly encountered lichen or species at risk lichen was blue felt lichen. We found a lot of this. This is an S3 federal protected special concern species and listed as vulnerable provincially. We found 130 new records, not new occurrences or not new element occurrences as we call them, but we found a significant number of records, and each one of these records will get a 100-meter buffer from whether it's cutting for forestry or commercial use. So it was great to get all of these protected. And I added a few photos just to show how different the lichens look when they're dry and wet. The top middle photo is when it's dry, and the bottom photo is when it's wet. And the bottom photo isn't actually super wet, but still enough to be quite a big difference. One more lichen that I'll just go over is not a species at risk, but it's one of my favorite lichens, and it is a tracked species. Peltigera colina, or tree pelt lichen. It's the only ceridiate lichen in Nova Scotia, or sorry, it's the only ceridiate Peltigera lichen in Nova Scotia, which is one of the ways it reproduces. We found 38 new occurrences. And going into the plants of Cape Breton, a few more interesting finds that we had. We didn't have a ton of plants just because we were there in mid to end of September as well as November. But a few interesting species: boreal bedstraw, Gallium kamchaticum. It's a Cape Breton specialty. It's the only place in Nova Scotia you'll find it, kind of on rocky slopes under rocky ledges. That's where I found this one here, as well as Michaud's sedge. Personally, I was excited to find it. This was a lifer for me, actually. It's not everywhere in Nova Scotia. It's more northern, and it's in nicer bogs. It's fairly similar to Carex folliculata, or I guess it's northern nodding sedge, maybe. But it's a beautiful species. Another interesting plant, which isn't native and it's not of conservation concern, but it's fairly new to the province, is hoary willow herb, Epilobium parviflorum. European plant. It's fairly common in southern Cape Breton, and I think it has been found in the mainland, but it's not very common, but it's becoming common in Cape Breton. So it's a good one to keep your eye out for. And if you go to the next slide, it's fairly similar to downy willow herb, if you know that plant. That's kind of more one of richer fens or richer swamps. Difference is that the habitat, obviously, it's more native habitat versus often disturbed areas for the non-native species. And the hairs in the stem of this one here, downy willow herb, are very perpendicular spreading and very consistent, whereas on the previous species, they're not quite as spreading. One more photo. I was kind of excited to find this in the field. I sat down along the edge of a stream bank at one point, and I realized that there are so many fern species around me, and they're not particularly rare, at least for Cape Breton, but I think this was within about 6 feet. I found 8 different fern species, and so I figured I would pick them all and take a picture of a fern lineup. Probably the more notable one here would be male fern, which doesn't exist on the mainland of Nova Scotia. It's only in Cape Breton, but it's quite common if you're in the right habitat in Cape Breton. One more thing before I'll let Burke take over. I just found one more moss. It's not a moss of conservation concern, but it really struck me in the field. It was kind of on this waterfall along the edge, and it was just completely coating this large waterfall area, and it was really beautiful. Plagiothecium species. It's called a type of silk moss, and so I just thought I would include that because it really struck me in the field. And now Burke will talk about one more thing and then get into some southern Nova Scotia stuff. Burke.
Thanks, Ian. I'm coming through clear?
Yep.
Good. Okay, yeah, so as we were doing this work on Cape Breton and with Ian and a few others, we were passing through some nice old rich forest. I've taken an interest in vascular plants as well as recently with lichens and mosses and liverworts, and anyway, I just noticed this large boulder completely carpeted with this liverwort, and just thought I would grab it, not even knowing what it was, because of course they're like, being a liverwort, it's very tiny, but it turned out that it was a species, this Jubila pennsylvanica, one of the leafy liverworts. So it's a very rare species in Nova Scotia, and only, I think, fairly recently, like all the eye naturalist records of it are quite new. It's been found only in 2 or 3 places, I think more down by the Annapolis Valley. So it's quite uncommon, and it was pretty tricky to identify it, because it was, there's an excellent book on bryophytes that was published by the folks in Quebec. There's a 3-volume set, but unfortunately it's only available in English. But anyway, that species is in the Keys in that book, but they only mention in the Keys. They don't have a page or description, and because it's never actually been documented in Quebec. So it turned out the description was bang on, and I think others have confirmed that the identity is correct. At least I'm quite glad I got a specimen. So it was kind of an opportunistic thing, but So if you want to flip to the next slide, Ian. Okay, so last summer we did a lot of work in I hope I'm pronouncing it right, in Kisputnik priority place, and I guess Bob had mentioned that you want a little bit more background now. Actually, before I moved into this position in with ACCDC, I actually worked with the federal government in Ontario, and so I had a little bit of background on these priority places. That basically the government, the federal government, decided to place a little bit more emphasis, its conservation dollars, on having people in different provinces identify sort of these large scale regional areas that have, where there's sort of the most, would be kind of the most bang for your buck in terms of spending conservation dollars. And so they have a number of these set up across the country. Like, for example, the Milk River area in Alberta, and in Ontario, the Long Point region is a priority place. So this is part of a federal network. And then the folks in Nova Scotia, they decided to nominate this southwestern part of the province. I'm not sure of the origin of the name exactly, but it basically encompasses, you know, the bulk of southwestern Nova Scotia. For its, there's a number of, as you know, number of vascular plant species that are found in this part of the province that are found nowhere else in Canada, including the ones that we're about to speak about. So there's funding, and we are just one of many projects that are going on in this region. There was a partners meeting, I think, back in November, where other groups, you know, academia and museums and things like that, conservation groups, they're working on other projects that got funding from the priority place funding from the federal government. And so the work that we are doing this year was a continuation. I watched Sean Blaney, our boss, his presentation from last year, and he spoke about some of the work that was done last year. So this is a continuation of what was done last year, and it sounds like we'll be doing more of it this year. So there was kind of two main components. The first one was quite short, where we surveyed the length of the Tusket River, just looking for rare plants in general, but sort of hoping to find things, the Sebacia Kennediana and the Coreopsis, that are both endemic to southwest Nova Scotia. So we did find some interesting things, but neither of those two species. But then the other component was doing lakeshore surveys for a very rare species of Idiocris, tubercle spike rush, which we'll talk about. And we were fortunate this summer. There was a graduate student from University of British Columbia who had some grant money, and he's from Nova Scotia, and he was able to help us for about a month last summer. So he was quite a good botanist, and he came in with us on a number of these Southwest surveys. So if we scroll down, I think Iain was going to speak a little bit about a couple of interesting things that were found.
Yeah, I don't think I'm muted, am I? No.
You're good.
So a few of the species we found on the Tusket River on our one day there, a couple track species. The first is the twining screw stem. It's a fairly uncommon species, but fairly easy to find in southwest Nova Scotia. It's a species of screw stem. There's another one called Bartonia paniculata, and the main differentiator is the opposite branching. So here you'll see branching coming off in pairs of two, all the way down, and you'll even find the leafy bracts at the bottom will be opposite. And that's the way to confirm that one. And then on the right, we found the southern rain orchid, Platanthera flava, variety flava. It's also another very southern species, quite uncommon along river shores, some lake shores. And so that was, we were happy to find that. And Burke.
Yeah, and here's some other examples of some rare species that we did locate along the Tuscan River. The eastern skunk cabbage, which is kind of a borderline rarity now, meaning it's if there's many more records found, it'll soon be taken off the list of track species. But it's it's got these very large sort of ovate leaves, and it flowers very early in the spring with these really bizarre looking sort of purple bracts around the flowers that are sort of function to keep the flowers warm in case there's a late spring frost. But we were out in August doing this survey, so the flowers and fruits are kind of long gone now. But it's pretty hard to miss that one because it's approaching the size of rhubarb, so it's quite a interesting thing. There's a few species of blue-eyed grass in Nova Scotia, but this is sort of the one that's the Atlantic coastal plain representative, this Cicerynchium atlanticum. Again, a kind of a borderline rarity, and one of the things that's neat about that is it has actually sort of a compound inflorescence. There's sort of a two-parted bract as opposed to the Cicerynchium montanum, which is a bit more sort of a, well, not boreal, but it sort of tends to be further north, and this is more of a much more characteristic of these lake shores and where there's low water levels. And we were lucky enough to see it flowering in a number of places when we were there. And next. So we got kind of lucky. I was along the Tuscan River, not far from the water's edge. There was an unusual sedge, and you must know that the Ovalis section of Carex is quite a difficult group to identify. But fortunately, I got a specimen of this one called Long's sedge. It's pretty interesting plant nationally. There was a record for Ontario, which turned out to be false. So that was, there is a record for Ontario, but it was 1905. It was the first and last time it was ever found there. So and I guess it's also introduced in British Columbia, but it hasn't. There's not many records of this sedge that had been seen recently. It was sort of on a kind of more of a grassier part on the riverbank shore, and I just thought it looked peculiar. So fortunately I there was enough there to collect a specimen. So that was one of the kind of, we expected, or we'd hoped to find it, but it was kind of one of the least expected species because it is becoming, so it hasn't been found a lot recently.
Okay, moving on to a few more species. On the left, Tradescans aster. It's not a track species for Nova Scotia. I believe it was a few years ago. But again, it is a southern Nova Scotia specialty, I guess you could call it. Kind of on these cobbly, rocky river shores. And I really enjoy the species. It's kind of like it's a very small aster. And it's kind of unique once you get to know it a little bit. I found a violet hybrid. I don't know if anybody here is into violet hybrids, but it stumped me when I first found it. I initially thought it was maybe a kind of a smooth, glabrous, non-hairy version of arrowleaf violet or Viola sagittata, which is what I initially called it until I had a chat with Sean Blaney, and he said that there's a fairly common hybrid Viola X sublanceolata, which is a hybrid of Viola lanceolata, which is common in Southwest Nova Scotia. It's the ACPF, as well as Viola McCluskii, which is the small white violet. So that was kind of a neat one to find, fairly distinct from the other violet species you would expect down in southern Nova Scotia. And it was not Viola sagittata, which would have been a nice track species to find. Burke.
Yeah, and so here's a couple of other things actually, and I did review Sean's talk from last year, and he mentioned both of these, but just thought we'd throw them in again this year because they are provincially tracked species. The netted chain fern, Lawrencearia areolata, and of course the species epithet is for the venation. I didn't zoom in quite enough on that, but the veins underneath are quite distinctive, and they form these kind of closed loops and network underneath, and those are called areolae, as you likely know. And it was reasonably common along the Tuscan River and a few other lakes, but it's really a nice thing to find, because again, it's another one of these things. Southwest Nova Scotia is the only place in Canada you'll find it. The other species that we were lucky to find along the Tuscan River is comb-leaved mermaid weed, provincially rare. Fortunately, I was able to ID this one just on vegetative characteristics, because there's two other species that are both occur in the area, and they're fairly similar. And this one, and all three of them are actually considered part of the Atlantic coastal plain flora. So I happened to be going kind of detouring away from the river. I wasn't too close. There was quite a nice bog habitat with a lot of sphagnum. It was quite wet, so I was a little ways back from the river, and it was really only a handful of plants that we saw after this, and walking several other lakes. So it was kind of fortunate to see it. The one that I'm used to seeing is where I'm in Ontario is Proserpinaca. The name escapes me, but it's tends to be underwater. More of the plant tends to grow underwater, and the above water and below water leaves look quite a bit different. So
Proserpinaca palustris.
It could be. I can't remember. There's three of them, and I think it could be. It also occurs in Nova Scotia, but it's just they're very distinctive, but they just you tend not to see them often. I say this was the only one we had seen in the entire summer.
Burke says that we were excited to see it, but actually he saw it himself. So I'm a little jealous of him that he chose the right side of the river to find it on. So next year it'll be my turn.
Yeah. Okay, so that's what the highlights the Tuscan River. It had been surveyed the year before, but we went to a different reach of the river and added some quite interesting things. So moving on specifically more, or this is now more about the actual lakeshore surveys that we conducted, and the aim of these was to try to locate this Eleochris tuberculosa, which is really quite a rare plant, and again, it's limited to Southwest Nova Scotia. I remember Sean had mentioned they had intended to survey for this last year, but water levels were quite high, and a lot of its habitat would have been underwater in the late summer last year, or in summer of 2021. But this year seemed to be good. We generally had suitable water levels. There was generally pretty easy walking, especially on the fairly the very low gradient shorelines, and there were some lakes where there was vast amounts of habitat, and you kind of have to zigzag back and forth. You couldn't just walk parallel to the water. And we discovered that we didn't find that many new locations, which I'll talk about, but the conclusion at the end was that yes, this continues to be a rare plant. We searched a lot of areas and didn't really add much more, so it's not like it was an overlooked thing, or at least last year it wasn't. Most of the lakes we searched, we never found any. So it is federally listed as a species of special concern. So not any protection by the Federal Species at Risk Act, because it's not threatened or endangered, but it's on the watch list, and it will get some management attention. They will have to write a federal management plan for a species of special concern, and provincially it's classified as vulnerable. So one of the things just to point out is if you do get it in fruit, which we did, we found most of the plants that we did find were fruiting, and it's completely unlike any of the other Idiocris species. So if you do see a fruit, they're generally abundant, but the tubercle on top of the fruit, the achene there is massive. It tends to be almost bigger than the achene. And I know somebody sent Iain an email, or Iain, I remember Iain put his on iNaturalist, and somebody commented that, oh yeah, you can see those tubercles from outer space. They're so big. So once you see it, it is pretty quite a distinctive plant. So fortunately, we were at the right time of the year to find it. So again, we'll show you the lakes that we did, but we did in the short summary of our success. There were 2 lakes where it had never been found before, and 1 lake where we knew it occurred, but we were over 1 kilometer away from where it had been. We were basically on the north half of the lake, and we knew it was on the south half, but Iain found a pile of it on the north half. And we started at the same point, and he walked the west shore and I walked the east shore. I found nothing, and Iain found hundreds. So it's just sort of the luck of the draw. Who knows, maybe currents or wave action, prevailing winds. I'm not sure why it was all over that dry. We had a mess of suitable habitat where I was, but it just wasn't there, or I couldn't find it. So this is just a summary of where the species has been searched for in the fairly recent past. You see the pink dots as places that it had been found by the ACCDC, and then blue areas we didn't go back to because we knew it had been there and within the last 20 years. So the yellow dots represent where we looked for it last year. And then the new populations, there was a lake called Mushpock Lake, and Iain was surveying an opposite shore as I was, and we found it on each side of the lake, which is pretty good. And then Quinnen Lake was a new lake, and yeah, and then Nonias Lake was the last one. It was quite a difficult one. Well, it took quite a while to get into because we had to paddle for 3 hours just to get to the study site. But I say it was worthwhile because we knew it was on the south end, but the north end's quite a bit further away. It's a fairly big lake, and we were able to find quite a bit of it up there. So on the next slide, okay, so this is the habitat that Iain found it on Nonias. You can see that the water level is quite far down, the high water mark being up near the shrub line on the left side there. It's probably all huckleberry along there. But you see there's moderate ice scar. There isn't a lot of competition with other plants. That you tend not to find it in amongst tall vegetation, and it generally grows where there's just a thin layer of organic substrates over top of sand or gravel, and that particular habitat isn't that common. But once you find it, then you really sort of hone in on that and look a little harder for it. But these lakes, not being huge, they don't tend to get a lot of big waves, and I sort of found that they tended to be in more sheltered bays and inlets, and often on kind of north shores and west shores. But again, if it was sort of a sheltered bay, it didn't matter as much. I think the wave action would likely just uproot new plants or wash away seeds or whatever. But that's just tended to be the places where we found it. So the next,
I'll just add one thing here, and I should have had a little arrow pointing to where it is, because the tubercle spike rush is in this photo. You just can't really see it because it's so small, but just so you kind of know where it is in this kind of in the really low, the low area with less competition. It was never found in these kind of areas that were closer to the water, and it seemed like it was good potential area, but it really didn't have enough organic matter. So it was where these areas with some graminoids, with some things like smooth sausage, Cladium marascoides. It would grow kind of within that where there was this moderate layer of peat. And it really wasn't a common little microhabitat that you found that often. But when you did, we were always quite hopeful.
Right. So this is somewhat similar. This is Mushpock Lake again. As I say, we found it on opposite shores of the lake. I tended to find, I found it sort of at a bog that was attached or adjacent to a lake, so it was a little bit atypical. And that site was a little odd in that I think it was doing well because there was a slight bit of disturbance. There had been a very light use, I think, ATVs going into hunt camps or something, and that's where it tended to be focused. And it was quite wet in there. There was a bit of, you know, ankle deep water kind of thing. But again, there was a little bit deeper organic substrate there, so it was right along the lake, but it was just, you know, also you know, 10 meters inland and into this kind of the edge of this this peat bog. So, but again, all this thin organic would be usually over top of these cobble sort of gravel lake shores is where you typically find it. But that was a nice surprise because we had no idea it was there, and we just both happened to find it on opposite sides of the lake.
Yeah, and this area here I was personally really surprised. I think I'd have to go back and find at least 4,000 stems just along this one section right here. And it didn't look like it was anything special when you kind of walked up to it, but when you kind of looked further, you saw these kind of little mounds of peat organic layer that had moderate competition, and wherever there was that, it was fairly consistently there. But visually, it's such a different look of the last spot that it's the plant that it's, you know, once you get experience, you start to kind of clue into these things a little more, which took some time for us. Sometimes we took some opportunistic surveys to look for some other rare plants or species at risk. One of them, Scirpus longii or Long's bulrush. And it has a lookalike, and the lookalike is Northwest Territory sedge. And they both grow in bogs. They both grow in areas where shrub cover is lower and sphagnum area is higher. And vegetatively, they look almost identical to my eyes. And so I found this one area off the corner of, I think it was McKay Lake. And it doesn't have these, one more. So they're both rhizomatous, but the Northwest Territory sedge, it doesn't grow in these semicircular colonies like Long's bulrush. Long's bulrush, it grows in fairly consistent circles. Sometimes they're kind of like hollow, like a donut circle almost, and sometimes they're kind of like a circular clump. And it's not fully clear why they do that, but it's a fairly good indicator of whether you have Northwest Territory sedge or Long's bulrush, just kind of from a faraway view. And in this case, we had the more common species. Going on kind of past the tubercle spikerush now into a few of the other interesting plants we saw over our field days. One of them is yellow ladies' tresses. There's a fair number of ladies' tresses species in Nova Scotia, and especially down in southern Nova Scotia. The taxonomy is a little weird on all of them. They're still kind of being figured out by, there's a botanist at the New York Botanical Garden who's doing a lot of genetic work on them. So we're kind of still figuring out the S ranks for them. This one has a S rank of S3 ? Which is the question mark is just added when we're not fully sure of its rank, and there's kind of a lack of information to a certain degree. But it does seem to be the most common Spiranthes in Southwest Nova Scotia, along with another recent species, Spiranthes archicephala, which is, I think it was only described maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And they both seem to be kind of the dominant Spiranthes species. This one, as the name would suggest, the yellow flower color is fairly helpful with ID, and I'm not exactly sure if that's a foolproof way to ID it, but it does seem like a fairly good way to be confident on the species ID, especially when it's fully mature. Another species we found, and I believe Sean mentioned this in his talk last year, but swamp loosestrife. Scientific name is Decadon verticillatus. It's an S3S4 species. It is the only member of its genus. We call that monotypic, so there's no other Decadon species in the world. It is called the loosestrife, so it actually is related to the non-native and invasive purple loosestrife. It's in the same family, or it's in the same family, but this one's native. And it can kind of form these mats, which almost may look non-native, kind of makes these arching stems along the lakeshore. But it's quite a beautiful plant, and especially when it's flowering kind of mid-August. We also, just kind of as a side note, we were looking for kind of extreme rarity historical species in New Brunswick. That was another project we had of kind of relocating these rare species records. And swamp loosestrife was one of them. And so we relocated one of two locations in New Brunswick. So it's very rare in New Brunswick, and it's still rare in Nova Scotia, but it's much more common for sure. Another sedge, which isn't too much of a rarity, but it's limited in its geographic distribution, especially away from the coast. Prickly bog sedge, Carex atlantica. I don't think it's actually called Atlantic sedge, but I just think it should be, so I tossed that in there. It's pretty distinctive. So all Carexes are known for their perigynia, which are kind of sacs which hold the seed. Carex atlantica has very triangular perigynia, more triangular than any other species you'll find. And it is part of the Atlantic coastal plain flora. A few more species we found, one tracked, one not, but they're both fairly southern Nova Scotia specific. Panicled hawkweed is the first, Heraceium paniculatum. It's one of the more delicate hawkweeds that you'll find. And you'll find it along roadsides and kind of dry forest. And like I mentioned with the swamp loosestrife in Nova Scotia, or in New Brunswick, panicled hawkweed was also one of the species we looked for. And we actually did find a large clump of it, which was the first time it had been seen in 40 years in New Brunswick. But it's more common in Nova Scotia. And this one here that I'm holding up was found just along a roadside by Quinnen Lake. And next is another species, Elliott's goldenrod, Solidago latissimifolia. You'll really only find it in southern Nova Scotia. It can be a little bit cryptic compared to some of the other species. It's one of the goldenrods known as the triple nerved goldenrods. There's tall goldenrod, there's Canada goldenrod, a few other ones, which all have these leaves with 3 central nerves. This one kind of has a more leafy stem a little bit. The leaves are kind of thicker, more waxy, with a club-shaped inflorescence on top, and it has just kind of a bit of a different look. And it's found in a variety of habitats in southern Nova Scotia.
So on our travels, I mentioned I'm interested in mosses, but we couldn't get too carried away with sampling mosses since they tend to be fairly difficult to identify in the field and need to be put under magnification. But so I just focused this summer on sphagnum, and every day I kind of keep my eye out, and I usually got 1 or 2 specimens every day. So wandering around these southern lakes, we came up with sort of these are the 8 species that I was able to collect and identify. And they're different habitats, like, papillosum and cuspidatum are typical in the acidic bogs, and you get full, like almost exclusively aquatic species like Torianum, and then you'd have a few just shoreline species. Lascurii was found, and in the treed swamps I was finding things like Sphagnum phallax. But I did manage to find one species that was provincially rare, this Sphagnum platyphyllum. It's in one of the sort of smaller subgenera of sphagnum, but it's because there's relatively few species, it's not as difficult to identify. But as you can see, I still had to have a look at the cells in the leaves of the stems and on the branches. But the stem leaves are, by sphagnum standards, are gigantic. They're 2 or 3 millimeters long, and they're quite robust, and you can actually see them pretty easily with your naked eye. So that was just sort of a side interests that I had, so it was kind of fun. And there's a few other really interesting ones, like Sphagnum macrophyllum goes down there, which I didn't see, but I believe that's tracked as well. I was hoping to see it. It's most similar to Torianum, but it's you kind of have to get in there with the microscope for that one too. So on the next slide, yeah, just some other interesting side notes. There was a liverwort that was fairly common on the lake shores there, and it's quite a big one, but these long ribbon-like leaves, the Lyle's ribbonwort, I must have found that on 10 lakes, and quite often in big patches. But it was interesting because I collected it a number of times, and in amongst the bases of the plant, there was 2 or 3 other very small species of liverworts that I'm still working on the identification. I thought I had it nailed down, but just somebody in iNaturalist just today was disagreeing with what I figured it was. But they're pretty tricky, and they're not a lot of really distinctive characters for any of them. So it takes a bit of effort to get them under the microscope and work through the keys with them. And this was there was quillworts along the lakes that were quite common. So as you know, they're mostly identified on the size and the characteristics of the macrospores at the base of the leaves. And so I did collect, I guess, from 6 different lakes, and I sent them all to an expert. I was able to look at the spores, but I just not that familiar with the keys yet, doing the ornamentation on the spores. But there's an expert in Ottawa that I know fairly well, and he's retired now. He's quite happy to look at them. So he determined that every one of them that I collected was Tuckerman's quillwort. So that was kind of interesting. There could be a few other species, including like Isoes riparia, and Prototypus, I believe, is another one that's down there. And I think some of them vegetatively are fairly distinct, longer leaves, deeper water and stuff. But these little short dwarf plants kind of look pretty similar. I wouldn't identify any of them without looking at the spores. So that was quite neat to get those. He was a little surprised that every single lake had the same species, because usually you get, he said you kind of expect, because it was a big area and slightly different substrates, he thought maybe there might be a little more variety in the species, but that wasn't the case. So moving on, so again, here's the map of what has been surveyed, what was surveyed last summer. And so this map shows places that we did not get to that I suppose would have potential for things, especially like the tubercle spike rush. There are other lakes, but we took sort of the combination of what hadn't been surveyed and what was relatively easy to access. So that the lakes that were left behind, they tend to be a little farther, a little harder. I mean, even some of the ones we were at, I remember towing the canoe down what we should have been driving on a road in knee-deep water. We almost paddled on the road. Some of the roads are getting flooded over by beavers. But if any of you are interested in coming out and looking for any of these species on some of these lakes, here's a list of some of the ones that have not been surveyed for that, and there could be more of them there, and it'd be great to have data on these water bodies, positive or negative.
And specifically for these lakes, a few of these we just didn't get to because we didn't have time, and a few of them because they were pretty hard. The easier ones are first, second, and third. They're just off the south of Pubnico Lake, or Great Pubnico Lake, I guess. And those are easier to access by road. But then if you look at Mattachak Lake, Cranberry Pond, and Wabe Lake, it's I think it's generally multiple kilometers of bushwhacking. And usually with the canoe and portaging, it's a little tougher to get to and a little more time consuming. I guess I can talk about some of our 2023 fieldwork plans. It's nothing too crazy here. It's a lot of it is just the continuation of previous work. So we'll be continuing the Sputnik priority place funding work. I don't know exactly what we'll be doing yet. We'll have to hear more from the boss. But it'll be some lakeshore surveys, some bog surveys, and then as well, a continuation of the Bredor Lake watershed surveys. We'll be for sure doing some lichen surveys and potentially adding some plant stuff in there as well. And we'll probably do a few a few surveys of NCC properties, which is something we did this past summer for a few spots. And so those may continue as well. And potentially other stuff as well. A few last pictures of Plymouth gentian or Sebacia canadiana, which we didn't find any new records of, but this is a photo of one of the more well-known Nova Scotia lakes, Wilson's Lake Ice, I'm pretty sure, which is where you can kind of find all the gamut of all the ACPFs right at your fingertips, basically. And it's almost comically easy how many you can find just by walking down a small woods road. And then fragrant water lily. And one last thing before we finish up, we are a data center, so we do love getting data from folks, especially keeners like you guys. The most valuable is rare species records, but all data is valuable, even common species, even bunchberry red maple, whatever it is, we're always happy to get it. And we can collect data a few different ways. Our preferred method is just through email. We have templates that you can download from our website, ACCDC.ca. And those templates have space to fill in a variety of fields if those are applicable. And we're happy to get email submissions. And then the second way we collect data is through iNaturalist, which I know a bunch of you on the call use. Me and Burke use it as well, quite a bit during the summer. But we download data from iNaturalist, and that gets put into our database and is quite valuable as well. And with that, if anybody has questions, happy to take some. Thanks for letting us chat tonight, and yeah.
And sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, thank you very much, Iain and Burke, both of you. This is very timely for us, given that we are focusing on a trip this summer, a 5-day trip in those areas. I mean, we won't be going to some of the more remote regions, but we are going to be going to several areas looking for a lot of these things. So this presentation was really timely for us in that side of it, and very well done. Thank you. So anyway, I shouldn't have interrupted because you probably have some questions, everyone. So please go ahead.
I was wondering, Dan Mills, I was just wondering if you found any sphagnum cyclophyllum in the south.
Sorry, I didn't catch the species name.
Cyclophyllum?
No, no, that doesn't ring a bell. I think that list that I had, I think that was everything. That was all the species there. I did some in New Brunswick and further north, but those are all the southern ones that I've had. And I'd say it wasn't anything systematic or intensive. It was just pretty opportunistic, just once a day. And I say the only anomaly was that platyphyllum, and but it was the only one that was sort of growing on over mineral soil. The other ones tended to be in sort of wetlands and peatlands. It was sort of a seepy area along a beach, and that's what sort of triggered me when I saw it. I thought, well, that's kind of an odd place. You don't often see them growing over, peat over top of mineral soil like that. So
Difficult to get to.
Pardon me?
It'd be difficult to get to it.
No, that one, I believe it was on McKay Lake or Phillip Lake, one of them.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, you could, I mean, I'm happy to put give you the coordinates for that one. It was, that one, I know we just launched the canoe right off the road, and it was, I can picture the site. It would be a 20-minute paddle to where it was on the shore.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
So you didn't find any Long's bulrush on your surveys?
No, nothing this year. We didn't really look that much. That wasn't really the purpose. And realistically, if you really want to get into the good habitat, you kind of have to make a concerted effort. It's not really along the edge of lakes too much. But no, we didn't find it this year.
It is at Wilson's Lake.
Sorry?
It is at Wilson's Lake.
Oh, is it? Okay. We were
Yeah.
just kind of at the very
There's a
start,
fin,
kind of
there's
the
a
easy
fin
button
near
nest area.
Kavanaugh Road,
Oh,
and it's on Nature Trust property.
Okay. Very good.
Nice. I did see some last summer I went to a known location that was close to a road. So we weren't looking, but we were fortunate because I noticed that Sean in his talk from 2 years ago said that it seldom goes to seed or flowers, but he said it did fairly well that year. And then last summer when I was out, there was quite a few of them that had flowers and fruit. I went in August 10th or so, and the stands that I encountered had lots of flowers and fruits. And I posted those on iNaturalist too, so quite an easy spot to get to.
Have you seen the tubercle spike rush at Wilson's Lake?
I believe it was there. Is that where we went to go and look for it specifically to get the sort of search image?
No, that was Barrington Lake. I think it is at Wilson's Lake, but we didn't bother to check that lake because it had already been surveyed, so it wasn't on our priorities. Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if it's there. I haven't seen it there, but
Yeah, it is a special lake.
Canadian Marascoides along the lake shore, and I expect it might be in that.
Yeah, sometimes we'd be walking along and you'd find the cladium and you'd find Rexia, Virginia, beauty, and you'd find these huge long swaths, and they would be kind of low gradient, and they would seem so good, but they either wouldn't have the organic matter that you needed to get the tubercle spike rush, or it just wouldn't be there. So sometimes the habitat seemed great, but it just didn't show up.
did you see any of the water pennywort?
We just saw the stuff at Wilson's Lake that's an already known location, but that's only known from 2 lakes, so that would have been quite the find if we'd found some more. But
sorry, you broke up on me there, Bob. I didn't hear your question.
Water pennywort.
Right. Do you remember, Ian? What was your answer, Ian? I didn't hear you either.
Oh, we just found it at Wilson's Lake at the known location. Yeah. Yeah. It's quite the species, though. Very, very cool.
I saw it. We were shown it by Peter Hope one time, and Kedgie. So it was right in Kedgie, and it's so long ago that I don't remember exactly, but I found it really quite captivating.
Yeah, it's pretty large. I was kind of surprised how big it was personally, because I've seen the other pennywort, Hydrocotyle americana, and it's quite big and kind of showy almost.
Okay, well, again, I'm going to thank you. Like, I have to admit that anything on Southwest Nova Scotia captivates me. It's really, it's such a cool collection of species that is spread out in all these pretty accessible locations for the most part, surprisingly so. So it's a real gem to have that in our province, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And thank you guys for documenting it, and for the ACCDC for making sure we have the records to know to conserve it and to help fight for preserving these populations. I mean, what's your sense with the things like climate change and changing water levels. Do you think any of these things are more under threat recently from things like this, or do you have a sense of that?
It's kind of hard to know. I mean, there's so many factors of climate change. One thing which it almost is in the favor of the ACPF is that as we get warmer, these species are already southern species anyways, so it's not like they're really boreal species that are going to get pushed farther north and farther north,
Right.
and disappear. So, but with changing water levels and different levels of precipitation for spring, fall, summer, what have you. But I think the main bigger threat would be habitat degradation and ATV vehicle use and shoreline erosion or shoreline.
Well, the other thing I wonder about is like ice scour. Like I gather that's a pretty major factor in keeping the areas clear from competition. And if the level of ice in the lakes changes, that might affect some of that.
Yeah, for sure.
So again, thanks so much for thanks so much to the ACCDC for every year coming through these presentations as well. They're just one after the other fascinating, and the work you're doing all over not just through Nova Scotia, but all through the Maritimes is very valuable and fascinating. And really, it's important that this is all being done. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
It
thanks.
was fun.
I appreciate the opportunity to share what we do and to put some names to some faces.
Yeah, it's nice to see a couple of new faces too. And we all like Sean, but it's good to know there's a few other people there,
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
nice. It's nice to know that there are people out there who are educated in the plants, know them, see them, also know the habitat in which they grow. They're out there documenting them, as and Nova Scotia it's not a big province, but it's very difficult to get around in it in places. And so people like yourselves who mind bumping through muck and off the beaten track and so on to find these rarities. And I'm sure there are lots more there to be found.
Well, have you heard about this new species of oxalis that was found in Nova Scotia?
Oh, right.
Yeah, so that's probably been there it's probably not new. It's probably been there the whole time. And somebody from Texas said something funny about that one. It's not on your list, and it should be. So we're gonna hopefully get some good specimens this summer. And
Just enlighten me, this new oxalis, what does it look like?
well, it looks exactly like all the other ones. It looks like the weedy ones, but it's a native
It's a
species.
yellow flowered one?
Yeah, and I think it's quite robust, and there's something about the pubescence on the stems. It's a little bit longer or something. But this person from Texas was studying them, and it does come up the coast, and she said she pointed it out and let Sean know and said, you should have a look at these because they look just like these southern ones, and they're not on any list up there. So, and they're accessible and they're probably really widespread, but people
Just have to know to look for them. Yeah.
know that they were different species. So, and I
The
think
the species is
and it's
Oxalis,
probably native too.
What's the species?
Oxalis colorea or colorea. Yeah, yeah, it's fairly cryptic, but
And it's within an hour of Halifax, isn't it? Where it was somewhere southwest of Halifax.
yeah, there's lots of observations, I think, in Lunenburg, Chester area, and kind of other disturbed areas. But yeah, it's another reason why it's always good to take photos of.
So is it
what
an
we
introduced?
think maybe.
Is
Yeah,
it native or
well,
native or introduced?
I shouldn't spepe so soon. I'm not
I thought it.
100% sure.
I thought it was. There's a good. The dialogue, or I guess I don't know if we got it through email, through work, or through iNaturalist, but I suppose once we see it and get specimens and look at the habitat, and if it's along rail lines or highways, then it maybe raises some red flags. I guess once we see and learn more about the habitat and its distribution, then they'd probably be able to make a better inference as to where its origins were.
And there is kind of a bit of a trend with some of these species, especially with climate change, like we mentioned earlier. Like you have these species which they'll be native to kind of the eastern seaboard and in the Carolinas, somewhere down there, and then they'll slowly move their way up. And it's hard to tell if you don't really call them native, but they're not really like a European introduction. So they're kind of in this kind of funky gray area. So it's not always easy to tell what their nativity is. Yeah, and the INET observations are in the chat there.
Yeah.
If you want to go check them out. Yeah.
Okay, well, the next time we're going to see people from ACCDC, I think, is in late June. We've got that hike up in Black River Bog that we're doing at the NCC. Doug's part of that, and really looking forward to that one. And we're probably going to try and do a little exploring around Lake Ainsley as well. I know Jeff is a place with some showy lady slippers. I think we may see if we can get him to point us to them.
Yeah, they're always a good one to find.
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, well, then I think anything else? I think I'm going to call tonight then. So
Okay.
see y'all. We will be contacting the board members again about meeting in the next couple of weeks, I think. And next meeting, we will also be emailing you its location. It'll be outdoors and hopefully someplace with some spring ephemerals or something similar to keep us interested. Okay. Well, good night, all.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Hi, thank you. That was brilliant. Very enjoyable.